Okay, I'm going to get started here. I'm going to let people in as they come in. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alistair Vaz. I'm an architect and I serve on the steering committee of the Carbon Leadership Forum here in Toronto. Really excited to have you here with us this afternoon. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. We're going to be talking about collective action and the efforts that the Daniels Corporation has made in this regard. Um, Going to start with the land acknowledgement, as we always do. As a Toronto-based group, we acknowledge the land we are meeting on as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. A little light housekeeping. We're going to ask you to enter your questions in the Zoom chat. We have a presentation, I think, today of about 25 to 30 minutes, and we have ample time, we think, to answer some questions thereafter. We recommend using speaker view. We also recommend that you keep your audio and video off. It really just helps with the bandwidth. And then finally, this session is being recorded and will be posted on our website, clftoronto.org. A little pitch here for a program we've just initiated. We just launched the inaugural Ontario Embodied Carbon Awards. This is a joint effort between CLF Toronto and CLF Ottawa. We're really excited about this. Entries are due this week. This is also your sort of save the date notification that we do have an event planned to celebrate these awards November 28th in Toronto at the CSI Annex, which is at Bathurst and Bloor. Really blown away by the sort of the support from our sponsors, but also the interest in the program. We're really excited with what this is going to do to this sort of conversation about embodied carbon in Ontario. So really looking forward to seeing some, if not all of you there. On to today's content. Today's talk is titled Let's Be Upfront. The Daniels Corporation talks embodied carbon. Joining us from Daniels are Adam Molson and Megan Wilson. Adam has grown with the Daniels Corporation since 2008, taking on a variety of roles prior to becoming Vice President, Rental Communities and Sustainability. Adam leads the Daniels Gateway Rental Communities Division. And on the sustainability front, Adam is leading the process of transforming Daniels into one of Toronto's leading low-carbon developers. Megan is a senior manager with the Daniels Corporation and played a key role in the development of the Daniels decarbonization roadmap, something I have a feeling we'll hear about today. Megan works collaboratively through all stages of the development process to support the design and construction of low-carbon communities, executing on the ambitious corporate goals to decarbonize the GTA's real estate development industry. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Megan. Start sharing your screen. I see that. Go ahead, Megan.
Okay, I think I'm actually going to get us started, and then I'll turn it over to Megan partway through. But thanks, Alistair. Thanks very much for the warm welcome, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As Alistair mentioned, my name is Adam Molson, and I'm VP of Rental Communities and Sustainability here at Daniels. For those of you who don't know Daniels, we're a GTA-based developer. We've been around for about 40 years, primarily mixed-use developer. Residentially anchored, but do at-grade commercial, institutional, and a bunch of other uses kind of mixed in there as well. So a couple of years ago, I started up the sustainability team here at Daniels, and our group has been leading the effort to change our approach to sustainability and our development process more generally. And I'm joined here today by Megan, who Alistair also introduced, who's been extremely instrumental in developing all the exciting stuff we're here to talk to you about today. So I'm going to start with a bit of an overview about our corporate approach, which focuses very much on carbon. And then I'm going to hand it over to Megan, who's going to go a bit deeper into the embodied side of the equation. And if all goes well, we'll have quite a bit of time at the end for questions. And we're really looking forward to hearing from all of you and really just having a bit of a discussion around this issue that's very much at the forefront of our industry today. So before I dive into it, I got to start with a shameless plug. So would encourage everyone on this call to go and check out our decarbonization roadmap, which was released in February of this year. can be found on our website with the URL just linked up there. We'll go over some of the highlights in a moment, but generally speaking, if you are interested enough in this webinar to register, then I can guarantee you're the right audience for this plan. So please do check it out if you haven't already. Okay, excuse me. So let's dive into it. So to launch off, we wanted to talk to you just about what went into our roadmap. And so as a company, historically, we'd approach things on a bit of an ad hoc basis. And so over the years, we'd grown from a small company to a large company, but we never really grew up in terms of our processes. And so what that meant was that for the longest time, everything was principally managed through the lens of a project. And so the questions around the office were, what do we need to do for this project to be successful? What compliance pathway do we have to navigate for this project for Toronto Green Standard, LEED, or what have you? Where do we see opportunities for social impact on this project? And our work as a team has really focused on reorienting those discussions to get the team to step back and say, hey, we're one of the largest developers here in the city. We've got an opportunity to leverage our size and scale to really lead on sustainability and other topics. So for us, it started with how do we want to define leading? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? And so pretty quickly, we decided that when it comes to sustainability and building performance, what we wanted to focus on was decarbonization and use that as the lens to drive our efforts. We did this very purposely because not only is climate change the top line existential issue, in the sense that if we don't solve it, then we're not around to really worry about anything else, but also because we felt it was very important to be focused in our efforts. And so we wanted to prioritize depth over breadth and really do that so that we could make a meaningful impact and do so quickly. The other critical decision was our approach had to be financially grounded. This had to be the art of the possible. And so we weren't interested in lofty goals that were so far out that they were realistically someone else's problem to solve. What we wanted to do instead was challenge ourselves and ask, how far can we go today and in the immediate future tomorrow? And how can we do all of this in a way that doesn't add any material cost? You know, as everyone on this call knows, we're in the midst of an affordability crisis in the Toronto area and Canada more generally when it comes to housing. And so how do we make change in this all critical area without exacerbating that other very, top of mind issue, I think, within our industry today. And so that was the approach that we took when setting ourselves up for the roadmap. So moving on, the product of all this roadmap is essentially, the product of all of this is the roadmap. And so again, would encourage you to check out our website and read it in detail, but the TLDR version is that we're committing to absolute whole life carbon emission intensity caps on the projects we build. And we're doing that right away. And we think that we can bring them down about 40% from our portfolio baseline in the immediate term. And then we plan to take another leap in 2026 and reduce our intensities again to deliver what we're calling near zero whole life carbon. And to be clear, these targets in these years are tied to the initial site plan date. So the actual sales launch, construction start, and completion of these communities are going to lag by several years, just as any project would as it goes through the normal development cycle. So for example, the first project under our roadmap had its initial site plan application in 2021, but it only went to sale in early 2023 and won't be finished until 2025. So that's always a bit of a thing when you're working through the long time scales of our projects, just how this maps out over time. Now, coming back to this idea of near zero, for us, we borrowed a little bit from the Toronto Green Standard that kind of had established that as the tier 4 level of performance on the operating side in terms of their roadmap. And we agreed that at least right now, this seemed to be the technological limit of decarbonization that could be achieved at scale using commercially available strategies here in the GTA. And this is all without the use of offsets or renewable energy credits. And so we're the first condo developer in the local marketplace to establish these public-facing targets and commitments for whole life carbon. But why we're here sharing this, talking to you guys out there on the conference circuit, is we hope that this inspires other developers to create a metric-based framework as well and commit themselves to reducing their emissions or the intensity of their projects as rapidly as possible. Okay, So you heard me mention the concept of whole life carbon a couple times in that, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I want to take a second here to just unpack what that means. When we construct a new building, we emit what's called embodied or upfront carbon. And this is all the carbon emitted through the materials that we use to construct the building and the construction processes themselves. While embodied is the more technically correct term, at Daniels, we're using the word upfront in our roadmap and our public facing material because it's more easily understandable by the layperson. And I think as everyone's can appreciate, when you're trying to take pretty dense technical topics, you want to try and uh, minimize the amount of level setting that we're having to do right now to really get to the meat of the issue while people are engaged. Now, after construction finishes and the building occupies, it starts to emit what's called operating carbon. I'm sure it's nothing new for anyone on the call. And this is all the regular daily functions, heating, cooling, lighting, etc. And so when we combine these sources and we take the cumulative emissions profile over a 60-year lifespan, and we align to the CAGBC zero carbon building standard in that regard, you take that all and cumulatively, it's the whole life carbon impact. And we quantify these impacts by studying the building design and using models to predict how the building is going to be built and how it's going to perform over time. And the reason we've zeroed in on this whole life carbon intensity as our key performance metric is that we want to normalize things on a per floor area basis so that we can compare between projects and set absolute targets without having the building size come into the equation. We also want to be able to report on how much of that whole life carbon intensity is attributable to upfront versus operating sources and study the key emissions drivers as we go through the life cycle of a project. So viewed another way, this chart provides a visual representation of how these emissions are released over the life cycle of a project. You can see that the upfront emissions are emitted upfront in that they all come in right at the beginning of the project prior to operations. And then once we get into the operations phase, these are released gradually over time. And so as you combine the upfront and the operating emissions over an assumed lifespan, that gives you the whole life carbon impact of the project, which is sort of what you see is the brackets on the right. Now, today, regulations, incentives, industry trends have been focused on reducing the annual operating carbon emissions. And so that's effectively reducing the slope of the line that you see here. And when we make efforts to drastically reduce the operating carbon emissions, the upfront carbon starts to take on a higher proportion of the share contributing to the whole life carbon impact. So if you also take into account when the emissions are produced and the fact that global climate targets are focused principally right now on the period between 2030 and 2050, upfront emissions become an even bigger piece of the pie. So if we need to rapidly reduce emissions, then we really need to start prioritizing reductions in upfront carbon. Now, back to our roadmap, as we were putting it together, we needed to establish a baseline that would serve as a starting point. And this would be something that we could refer back to and give us something to report improvements against over time. And so this graph here shows you our baseline. We studied 5 high-rise projects that started the development process between the years of 2018 to 2020. And again, we're defining this as projects that filed an initial site plan application with the local municipality in line with sort of the TGS methodology for determining what version you're under. And so in this chart, above the horizontal axis, we see the operating emissions in that sort of orangey tangerine color. And below in blue are the upfront emissions. And the whole life carbon is the sum of the two. And what we noticed right away when we put this together is the variance in operating emissions. Our highest emitting project from this baseline group of projects was emitting 3.5 times more CO2 into the atmosphere per square meter than our best performing project. And both of these were being delivered around the same time. So this was a bit of a light bulb moment for us, just lining all of these projects up. All these projects were financially viable. They had all been given the green light. They were all proceeding to construction, yet we saw a huge gap in performance. And so this really made it clear to us that we needed a portfolio-wide approach to decarbonization so that we could remove this variability from project to project. And this would ensure that all of our buildings are performing at least as well as our current best going forward. Now, onto the baseline level of performance of 1660, that gave us a starting point. But really, it's just a number. On its own, it doesn't mean a whole lot. So we always like to use equivalencies or try and, push and pull at things to try and get it to land with people. So another way of thinking about this is that our baseline of 1,660 kilograms of CO2 per square meter is equivalent to the same amount of emissions that come from 4 barrels of crude oil. So imagine if you were to take a 25-story condo tower, which is, pretty average project for us, and imagine you were to build a ginormous stack of oil barrels, 4 on every square meter, up to the same size, height, massing of that 25-story building. And then imagine you just set it all on fire. That's effectively what's produced from one of our baseline buildings over their lifetime. Now, to be clear, this isn't a Daniel specific problem. All the developers in Toronto are likely in and around the same ballpark of performance, maybe a little better, maybe a little worse. But we're one of the few putting ourselves out here by quantifying this numbers, publicly publishing it, disclosing it, taking accountability, and really doing what we can to start to bring them down as fast as we can. And so as you see on the next slide coming up, this is what our roadmap looks like over time. We're from, baseline to our first generation, we're reducing things by 40%. And then by 2026, just a few years after, we're going 64% reduction. And so you see here the absolute caps at the top in green. And then you'll see sort of the orange and blue showing, roughly what we think the split is going to be between operating and embodied emissions. And you'll see the line's a little bit jagged, and that's on purpose. And that's to give ourselves flexibility, because at the end of the day, what we really care about here is the total carbon emissions, whether it's reduced in the operating phase or the construction phase, the time value part notwithstanding, carbon is carbon. And so we really wanted to give ourselves opportunity to be as flexible and opportunistic as possible in terms of getting the best bang for our buck in carbon reductions, while still sort of delivering on that affordability mandate that I spoke about earlier. So to wrap up this section, we've got a few takeaways. And as a little aside, Megan designed this slide, and when I first saw it, I was like, all right, awesome. Legend of Zelda. I remember that. It's cool that you know that. And this is where my age started to show. She's actually like, you know what? This is just some meme I saw on the internet a couple times. Don't know what Zelda is, but glad you like it. So I don't know why I'm sharing that, but just a fun little aside from what goes on behind the scenes as we're jamming on doing this. And I guess the point is we try to have fun as much as this is a serious topic. You got to make it fun and have fun with it. But the real takeaways from this journey is, for us, it was critical to figure out where we can drive results in a way that aligns with the values of our company and fits our approach for doing business. A lot of what we'd experienced before and what we've seen from our peers is really relying entirely on an external standard. And there's a lot of value in referencing the external standard. And as much as possible, we've set up our roadmap to align with external standards. But ultimately, external standards are trying to be everything to all people. And for us, we wanted something that was truly going to deliver and allow us to execute in a way that was very aligned with our business. So that was sort of the first step. The next sort of real takeaway for us was just to make sure that we were bringing the can-do spirit to the development of the strategic plan that's the roadmap, but then how we're going to execute it, which Megan's going to talk about in a second. And so the challenges ahead of us are large, but the optimism is key. And leadership in this can come in many forms. Sure, it can start at the top of the org chart, and that certainly makes things easier. But leadership can also come from those in the trenches who lead by example. Lastly, time's of the essence. We've all seen vaporware after vaporware of climate plans announced, and yet we're not really in any better situation than we were several years ago. And so for us to really start to move the needle, we got to move, and we got to move quickly. And so yes, for us, we had to take the time to figure out how we were going to step away from ad hocism, lay out a strategic plan, and start to execute. But we thought it was really important not to get too bogged down in the details and making sure that everything was perfect. Again, this had to be about the art of the possible. And so for us, we needed to focus on identifying what drove the biggest impact, focus on getting some quick wins, and generate some momentum. And we don't have a moment to lose here with climate change. And so for us, it was how do you move quickly and start getting results right away? So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to hand things over to Megan, and she's going to dive a little bit more into the specifics of what we've been doing to start to tackle upfront carbon. Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so I guess Alistair gave me a bit of an intro before, but Megan Wilson, I'm Senior Manager of Sustainability here at Daniels, and I've been with the company for, I guess, just over 2.5 years now. And I guess as Adam mentioned, just really seeing a lot of the transformation sort of like over that time, relatively short time span to kind of go through pretty much initial inception of sustainability team through to kind of like putting out our public roadmap just about 2 years later. So it's been a bit of a wild ride. So especially on the upfront carbon front, because there's just so much new stuff going on. So we'll share some of the exciting stuff going on there, including we'll decode our targets a little bit, dive into the upfront side, and talk about the tools and processes that we have in place really to support all this good stuff. So firstly, zooming in on those roadmap targets that Adam shared a little earlier, but now just specific to the embodied carbon, kind of like chopped off the top half of that chart. So here we just see our baseline Gen 1 and Gen 2 targets, along with the associated years at the bottom, just for the embodied carbon. So just a reminder that these targets only apply to our high-rise development portfolio. Since we know that our low-rise portfolio is generally lower than this, we set kind of the high water mark or cap for emissions through our roadmap. And if you recall, these targets of 400 and 300 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared are actually, we call them soft targets, since our key metric is for whole life carbon. So there's some flexibility on how we're actually going to meet our goals, balancing between the upfront and operating emissions. And so the intention of this is to allow us to decarbonize most efficiently while dealing with real life project constraints, which a certain project might lean one way or the other, kind of depends on what pops up when we start going into design. But these guidelines exist so that we have something to aim for really right from the get-go. And so when you compare our average baseline project, which clocked in at around 385 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, to our Gen 1 target of 400, you actually notice right away that our Gen 1 target's higher than our baseline. And so the reason for this is because the error bars that you see on the baseline number, we're actually giving ourselves a little buffer here in these first like 4 or 5 years to be successful. Since especially in this first generation, there's a lot of projects that will have naturally higher embodied carbon footprints, such as easy one, higher parking ratios. And throughout this phase from 2021 to 2025, we're really focusing on establishing processes and methods first before committing to that drop of that 25% reduction across our entire portfolio to that ECI cap of 300s in that second generation. So again, that would be any project going to initial site plan in 2026 or later. So especially on the embodied carbon side, there's a little bit more of a runway there in terms of like the technological advances that we can get to before the actual, let's say, construction start, when we're just talking about initial site plan in 2026. But we really want to be intentional about the way we're just designing and approaching projects from the get-go and really formalizing this and getting better and better sort of as we go through these next generations. So that's really key. So of course, when you start publishing external commitments to decarbonization, it's honestly a little scary, as Adam mentioned. So you do feel very exposed now that you've got your data and targets really out there for review and I guess constructive criticism by the industry. So, but in honesty, we've gotten so much positive feedback on just having targets and commitments to reducing whole life carbon, and specifically the addition of absolute targets on the embodied side to a sustainability framework is relatively new and pretty at the cutting edge. So we've gotten a lot of kudos there as well. And one of the original objectives of this that Adam mentioned was really just to plant a flag and say, okay, this is what we've got. Here's where we want to go. We know we're not perfect, but let's just talk about it and like start that conversation. So just having those conversations in industry is so key to moving all this forward. So kind of coming back to the slide, we know we're not perfect, but let's put it out there. How are we not perfect? So again, we're focused on these absolute metrics for embodied carbon intensity, but the reality is there is still a serious lack of high quality data that we can reliably use and actually have confidence that we're accurately modeling our buildings, and the availability of that data and the quality of that data actually changes from year to year. So if you're setting a baseline from 2018 to 2020, already there's like new data coming out there and saying like, okay, you can look back at that baseline and say, is is this the best data already? It's like, we could look back and see, but let's just wait. Let's keep steering the course. So the biggest variable on that is going to be on the enclosure side. Like, it's just such a complex system. There's so many different elements, different inclusions, exclusions from all the different EPDs and manufacturers, and just the lack of product-specific data from our local suppliers has made this really challenging. So this leads into number 2. We can use our absolute figures and targets to easily compare between our own projects, since we see all the nuts and bolts that go into project A's LCA versus project B's. But once you start trying to compare it to another developer, we've seen that it starts to become difficult to line things up without commissioning an entire QC review process. So a little not that great, but what gives us confidence to just keep steering the course is that we have seen benchmarking studies like the one published by Mantle, U of T, and City of Toronto. And while we're definitely on the lower end of what they've seen in their benchmarks, we have confidence that we're at least within the right order of magnitude in that like high 3s, low 4s for a baseline. So we keep that as a green flag. Like, let's just keep going. Let's just keep moving. So again, segues into the third point. So this kind of when we were creating our baseline, there were decisions to be made around what assumptions to use. So in theory, you can like have a higher end baseline today, but if you're not paying attention to the assumptions being made, especially if you leave a lot of this work just to the consultants, they can actually, you're using a different consulting group on your next project, they could just pick different EPDs just by chance that are completely legitimate and justifiable, but they just happen to show a lower embodied carbon intensity than what you originally used. And this could sort of lead to almost an artificial sense of reducing emissions when you actually haven't done anything. But since we're trying to use our baseline and our whole data framework for not just reporting purposes, but we're trying to build up a whole infrastructure around decision making with this data, we did want to be on the more aggressive side, so that only real sort of legitimate improvements would actually show up in our data. So this does make us look a little bit on the lower or better side today than others, but we know just fundamentally that these baseline projects are really no different than any other concrete high-rise building in the GTA, but we just want to make those steps to kind of move forward and start reducing it. So either way, right now, we're just trying to use the data as a tool and not really get too caught up on how this compares to others, at least not yet, since there does need to be more precise modeling guidelines released at some point. And as I mentioned, this will likely trigger some sort of mass renormalization of our data and a lot of our industry peers, and just give overall more confidence to start comparing across each other's and allowing a little more scrutiny across the industry. So in short, even with these challenges, really don't wait for everyone else to perfect these methods. Just start with just commissioning a few life cycle assessments or LCAs, and you'll just start to be able to understand the process and the results. And more importantly, don't get actually too caught up on the data itself, where you start just treating performing an LCA like a box checking exercise. Really take that data, analyze it properly, use it as a tool to figure out what the story is and how you can actually start to take it and start to drive value for your business. Which kind of brings us to our section on the tools. So how do we actually start to drive this value that we keep talking about, rather than treating sustainability as another cost or owner certification or just like gold sticker that you hang on the wall? So just kind of created these 3 buckets of tools that we're using today, both to study and start reducing embodied carbon. First of which is the technological tools. So this kind of encompasses the actual innovations, different pilots, or research and development efforts that are undertaken more on the technical side in order to actually achieve these reductions in embodied carbon. Number 2 is capacity building. So this includes everything that we need to do on the back end to ensure our LCAs are integrated into standard practice and that those processes are as standardized and streamlined as possible. And also, what milestones are we using to ensure that we're getting accurate enough information, but it's also early enough in the design process that we can make those changes as required. And the third bucket is analytics and decision making, which is really the culmination of the 2. So in terms of what physical tactics can we deploy and how can we measure the impact or cost benefit of these tactics to ensure we're actually making the right decisions to get the best value add in alignment with our project specific and portfolio wide goals. All right, so a little bit of a deeper dive into this first bucket of technological tactics. We have a relatively simple approach for embodied carbon. Really, the 2 big buckets are material efficiency and low carbon materials. These are nice broad umbrellas that a lot of different items can fall into, but I'll just give a few examples in each. So firstly, for material efficiency, in general, this one's pretty easy, I think, just across the industry. It's really easy to corral the masses, especially internally on this one, since many of our teams really want the same thing, which is reducing materials. That'll mean lower cost, shorter construction times, really the works. So that one's easy, or sounds easy. So one good example of this is how we're on a bit of a mission to reduce underground parking. So in collaboration with our construction and development teams, we've submitted embodied carbon arguments to municipalities as part of parking variance applications, where we're actually able to have memos that show hard numbers on exactly how overbuilding underground parking, especially in transit-oriented areas, really just undermines municipalities' own climate goals, both in terms of the embodied or industry emissions locally, but also through promoting private vehicle use through all those transportation missions to follow over the years. And so this has been a pretty big win that we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on. And obviously municipalities take a lot of different factors into consideration outside just the sustainability argument, but this in itself has definitely caught the attention of the municipalities as a bit of a different argument than just sales numbers or otherwise. What's my neighbor doing? It's like, this is actually fundamentally a little bit different. So it's been an interesting ride. However, on the structures themselves, we've also found that thankfully our structural engineers are already quite efficient, and we haven't seen any huge anomalies in our structural designs that we've analyzed to date. And the changes that we're seeing are relatively on the margins, such as cutting down a 250 millimeter slab down to 200, or cutting down some balconies. And we also want to do some studies on what savings we achieve if we select lighter enclosure systems. So anecdotally learning from project to project, every possible way to shave down a couple hundred meters cubed of concrete here or there, it will add up over time. And by collecting and processing the data, we want to have a solid repository of all these different strategies and get a series of benchmarks that we can use to start comparing projects and being a little bit more critical on new projects coming forward. And so exactly how we take that data, I'll get into that a little bit more. But in reality, a lot of the big wins on the structural side, such as eliminating massive transfers or more efficient massing, we've seen them actually, unfortunately, driven by external factors like urban design or ensuring that we have functional suite layouts, which is just a reality. You obviously don't want to just build a soulless cube. You kind of have to make sure people live in it and it's a beautiful city. So these external factors are obviously super important, and they're definitely items that we want to study more and will definitely start to come more into play as we move into the higher or lower caps on ECI for our future generations of projects. But right now, we're still working in the background to just build up that knowledge and tools to evaluate these bigger drivers sort of in the meantime. All right, next one. So for our low carbon materials, this is where it does get a little bit more complicated. And again, I'll just give one big example on what we've been doing on this front, which is the use of low carbon concrete today. And I always thought, to be honest, low carbon concrete, it seemed like really low hanging fruit or just no brainer, just specify low carbon concrete, just do it. But in reality, there is so much pressure on our procurement, construction, and site teams today to deliver on schedule and within budget. So changing absolutely anything about the way we procure or build on site is going to be a challenge. But one that we are looking to overcome through just a super intentional approach to piloting and collaboratively just debunking some of the resistance or misconceptions with our site team about the product. And it's just been a big effort to date. So concrete, of course, is the largest contributor to upfront carbon. And while our number one strategy is just to use less of it, we're also undergoing this large pilot to pour as much of the EcoPack standard and prime products as possible on a single project, which is our Daniels on Parliament mixed use site in Regent Park in Toronto. And we're going to use this to study how we can actually deploy this low carbon concrete at scale without significantly impacting the budget and schedule. And so what we've learned to date is that concrete is actually both an art and a science. And while low carbon concrete like EcoPack, especially the standard product, claims little to no impact on workability and curing times, it is a little bit more complicated than that. And there's a lot on the line just to, again, dive in and make some sort of sweeping declaration across the board without that proper testing and verification. So right now we're focusing on building up our site competencies. So it's getting comfort with the product and validating its performance and properties on non-critical path items, which have been primarily in the below grid structure. And so what we've seen is that while the low carbon concrete is performing well, as we get onto the critical path and move above grade, we need to discern what factors are actually linked to the EcoPact product themselves, or just a function of the realities faced on site with typical concrete too, because it's easy to sort of point fingers at a new product, whereas when you're using typical concrete, there's also sort of like tips and tricks that they deploy. So one example that we've seen is that there are methods done, which people probably aren't going to be happy to hear, but there are things done where with conventional concrete, where in order to meet the demands of budget and schedule, they'll actually add sort of those high earlies or increase the concrete strength above the design to ensure that it is coming up fast enough. So our teams will actually sort of in situ balance between the cost and the schedule on a daily basis when they're actually ordering the different concrete mixes. And so now, of course, by adding carbon, we're also trying to optimize for this carbon footprint as well. So an already complex balance between cost and schedule now turns into a 3-variable equation between cost, schedule, and carbon. And the only way to achieve this is really through a super engaged site team with a whole nother layer of knowledge on what are the actual carbon drivers of the concrete that they're ordering, and make sure that they have proper buy-in into the project to also prioritize carbon as well. So this has been a bit of a learning curve. I think we're gonna be publishing our results probably next year or the year after. I don't know. I don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, our intention is pretty much to take all this consolidated knowledge and really get it out there. We don't want to be gatekeeping this stuff, but we do just want to be super transparent that, again, this has been a huge learning curve. All right, so this also segues into our next bucket, which is called capacity building. And so when it comes to actually deploying these decarbonization tactics, just like I mentioned in our low carbon concrete example, there needs to be just a level of knowledge and processes in place really to support them in order for them to be successful. And so one of the biggest pushes that we're undergoing right now is on stakeholder engagement and education, especially now that we've publicly launched our decarbonization roadmap. We need to ensure that all our internal teams and external partners actually understand it and understand what it's going to take to make it happen. So we've seen a lot of value in internalizing some competencies. As a vertically integrated developer and builder, we have a lot of hands in every aspect of each project, and having the technical knowledge as well as internal insights onto how the decision-making and development process really works is the only way that we're able to drive this forward. So by increasing the baseline level of knowledge overall, we're not just technically more adept to execute, but we need to gain this, again, this internal buy-in on pushing out these new initiatives, which is super important, again, when you consider the complexity and pressures that our project teams are already on. And since our sustainability team is small, in an organization of, I believe, over 450 people now, the dissemination of this knowledge will be able to broaden the reach and increase the efficiency of deploying these tactics so that other teams can push forward on their individual fronts. It's like we don't need to be driving every single team. You can kind of, I don't want to say set it and forget it, but something along those lines. So pretty much our goal is to ensure everything that we learn on a day-to-day, those smaller wins like our 250 to 200 mil slab story, to those big pilot projects, like the broad deployment of EcoPact, can then be actually consolidated and then deployed at scale. And then this actually becomes our new standard practice. And this will ensure that the work that we're doing has the largest impact by retaining that knowledge and sharing in between projects, and that the findings don't just get shelved and forgotten. And so it's not just the technologies that we're standardizing, and I may have alluded to this a little bit before, but we also need to standardize our methodologies and how we're measuring this data. So on the embodied carbon side, as Adam mentioned, we're adhering to the Zero Carbon Building Design Standard for LCAs, which just includes the main elements of foundation structure and closures. But one of the biggest issues that we've seen is that since we don't have product-specific EPDs for every single element and every single supplier that we use, we do need to make some of those assumptions and pick similar products to represent the materials that we are using. And so as I mentioned, there is going to be some room for error here. So we've tried to standardize those assumptions as much as possible by creating our own materials library of assumptions that we've used in the past, so that we're reducing some of that variability from project to project. And so we've also used this information to create a two-way dialogue between a lot of our consultants as well, so that we're able to compare methods and results between those relationships as well, and ensure that best practices are being followed across the board as they rapidly evolve. And so we're also standardizing the way that data is collected and reported to just make it easier to ensure that we're on track and line up our projects, which leads into the next slide. in terms of specifically standardizing the data collection and reporting processes. So we've worked with some of our core consultants to actually develop this results reporting template, and we call it our carbon benchmarking tool. And so this tool, it lives in Excel, which is just way more convenient, and it reports back the key design drivers as well as a summary of the results so that we can really drive into what's happening inside of the models. And so this was developed because one of the issues we've had was with consultant reports just exported as PDF, 10 pages of PDF. They're just really dense, very difficult to read, and every single consultant has different formatting style, order of operations, and it's just really time consuming and difficult to understand sometimes. So by standardizing this, putting it into Excel, we can make it very familiar, and it's just easy just to look at the data directly without any of the frills and understand what's going on inside the project right away. And so we're then able to process this data and actually embed those results into our management reports, which you see on the right. And so now carbon performance of our projects will actually be front and center along with our other KPIs so that we can use this as a tool to make decisions on a project and ensure that it's meeting our corporate objectives. And so this also ties back to the knowledge sharing capacity building aspects of our plan to ensure that everyone in the organization can actually have the baseline understanding to read and understand a simple one-page snapshot of the carbon performance of their project that they're involved in so that they can participate in these informed conversations as a group and not just a sustainability team over on an island somewhere blowing smoke. It's just really, really critical that everyone understands and is front and center. So now how do we take this data and really bring it into the analytics and decision-making side? So again, we're taking this data and we don't want to just check a box. We need to collect the data and then take it a next step further so that we can actually consolidate it into standard format and then actually line it up between multiple projects. And so on the back end, our sustainability team will take our carbon benchmarking tools and then line them up in what we call our diagnostic tool. You can see here that it uses almost like a heat map to highlight variability in projects in the results as well as the design inputs. And it allows us to vet certain assumptions, ensure that we're always aligning the design with our best practices that we've decided on, and reviewing the results and say, okay, again, in detail, why is building A performing better or worse than building B? And can we actually apply that one to the other? And also this really allows you to see right away if there's any anomalies in the modeling itself, some funky assumption or floor area that's messed up that can just cause outliers right away. So similarly, on the more broader side, we're able to develop what we call a performance dashboard, which takes our management reports and line them up with all of our different projects to help add a little bit of context between the different sites. So in reality, it is difficult for someone without a background in sustainability or just super in the weeds of all this stuff to totally understand on the absolute figures, is this project good or bad? So by being able to compare between projects, we're hoping to somewhat gamify carbon reductions internally. And our ultimate goal is really to have leadership coming to us and saying, hey, why is that project over there doing better than my project in these specific areas? How can we actually improve and really start that dialogue from the executive level? And so that's the dream. And I think just being able to like communicate it in a super simple, effective way is really just the first step in achieving that. All right. As for next steps, so on the technological side, we are still in the early days of building out those different strategies and piloting various projects, but we need to keep building them out through internal and external collaboration. We want to continue to expand areas and partnerships to find, of course, these more low carbon material options and work closely with our various sustainability and structural consultants and our architects to find more solutions to more efficient material use. And then, of course, even expanding the scope into different things like interiors or other areas is definitely on our hit list. So we're also continuing to build up these different libraries of standards and resources that will ideally make the whole process more efficient and free up more time as we're able to sort of pass these nicely packaged plans and standards and resources onto our other groups that'll sort of make us more efficient overall as our sustainability team can sort of expand into those new pilot areas instead. And so, of course, we also need to continue to build up our data set and just get more experience with our LCAs and dive into just structural design, all that good stuff even more, so that we do have more confidence in our analytics and, of course, resulting decision making. Again, another inside joke. We have fun with this. Our next step, we call it sort of world domination. So really this is expanding more into the external world. A lot of what I've talked about today has been just like, okay, what are we doing kind of like inside our bubble? We've kind of obviously opened it up to this group, but in reality, the next step is we need to actually start doing stuff in the external world, which is of course adding more low carbon material specifications into our procurement processes. This is going to require a lot of collaboration with our key trade partners and suppliers. I do have a good example of this one as well. So we've kind of already started this one, but it's a work in progress, is starting to issue a specification for limiting embodied carbon intensity for rebar, which is kind of the next one on our hit list, of course. But what we found through conversations with our suppliers is that they're really currently set up for, I don't want to say the old way, but they're set up for LEED, which just prioritizes recycled material content. So they're able to say, okay, I can guarantee you recycled material content. But if we say, okay, can you guarantee me that the rebar is from suppliers A and B and not C, they're not able to do that because they're just not set up that way in the back end. So we want to just continue this dialogue with them and see if we can actually start to leverage that LEED infrastructure that they've already built, but modify it to suit carbon intensity instead. And so this is going to be a challenge. Just we've learned that the way that the product is warehoused and tracked, and again, just schedule procurement pressures that our suppliers are under as well. It just makes developing these new processes difficult, but we're hoping that industry pressure and just demand for this overall will just expedite the process, and we're going to get there pretty soon. So also just on that note, generally collaborating more on research and development and these pilot projects with our existing and new partners is going to be a really exciting next step as well. And then taking all of it and really feeding it back into our internal framework and all the stuff that we're doing inside to continue driving this value internally is really our ultimate goal. So a lot of exciting stuff coming through. So yeah, in conclusion, that's pretty much it. Yeah, just thank you so much for joining us today. I think, I don't know, I hope it's going to be a good conversation. I think, sorry, we took up a little more time, but we still got 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Megan. Thank you for the presentation, for the transparency and sharing your process. I really hope it sort of struck home. I particularly enjoy the title, like, this idea of upfront carbon, I think is super accessible. And I don't know who came up with the moniker, but in my head, it's always been Lloyd Alter, and Lloyd's here. So hi, Lloyd. And so with that, I guess let's jump into a couple of questions that have come in. I would encourage people to, at this point, you can continue entering questions in, or you could just turn your camera on and your voice on, and you can ask them yourself. But starting with Susan here, asking a question. I think she speed read your sustainability roadmap while you were talking. She says here that she sees that the 2026-2030 goal for TEDI, which is your thermal energy demand intensity, is 30 kilowatts hour per meter square. Did Daniels consider pursuing the passive house standard, where TEDI is half of that?
So yeah, I can speak to that. So we actually have a passive house pilot project that's in a pretty advanced stage of design. And because we're a glutton for punishment, we're not piloting just passive house on it, but also our first mass timber project all together in one project. We figured if we're gonna not make money, let's at least not make money altogether on one project. So for that one, we do have it in. I can't remember the exact performance. Megan can remind me. I think it's got a whole life carbon somewhere in the like 400 range. So it's actually materially even better than our generation 2 targets. And the reason for that, again, is sort of thinking about that whole affordability angle. We're sort of pushing to the limits with this pilot, but we know this is a premium project. And so the question is going to be, are we going to be able to take the learnings and say, okay, can we get to 80 or 90% of that performance, but then peel away most of the premium? The reality, unfortunately, right now, is this project is actually on a bit of hold because the last round of numbers that came back, especially just with the interest rate having really, changed since we launched it, have actually pushed this project into the not just not making money, but actually losing a lot of money. So we're actually pausing it. We're going to have to kind of reevaluate and sort of see if there's a way to re-engineer it to tighten it up. So all goes to say, while our roadmap shows the 30 kilowatts as sort of roughly where we think we're going to end up, this for us is more of just a soft guide. And generally speaking, we're actually not in favor of hard TEDI targets. This is actually feedback we've been providing to municipalities such as Toronto as they've been doing their standards. Ultimately, what we care about here is emissions and emissions intensity. And we want to make sure that we're giving ourselves and ideally the industry as much flexibility to deliver the lowest emissions as value driven, i.e. affordable as possible. And so at the end of the day, if Teddy needs to be 32, but that's actually what allows us to kind of deliver this building in the most value driven way, then we want the flexibility to do that. And that's kind of how we're structuring our stuff.
Great, thank you, Adam. Andrew Payne has a question here. This has to do with sort of material selection, which you spoke to, Megan. How does the durability of the materials factor into the whole life carbon calculation?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think that's sort of another frontier that we haven't touched on directly yet. I think it'll definitely come in when we start talking about, let's say, shaving down structural and area ABC. But the only way it's actually factored in right now is through sort of like the back end of the LCA methodology, when you have to like pretty much like input assumed lifespans for things. So it's like we're not actively optimizing for that yet. I think again, we tried to keep our framework relatively simple and isolated. Everything's very modeled. So again, I think that's another frontier that we're definitely going to look into.
The one thing I would add is like right now, we've definitely been prioritizing the structure just because we think that's where we can get our best sort of bang for a buck. And there might be the most availability of sort of low carbon options. I think this is really going to come into play when we get to enclosure. You know, the structure generally is lasting longer than the 60 years of the building, where the enclosure is where you start to get into sort of midlife replacements, and that's going to become much more of a factor.
Great. There's a question here from Mohammed. What are some of the resources that you refer to while creating your upfront carbon benchmarking tool?
Yeah, I guess in creating our benchmarking tool, I mean, the benchmarking tool is really, I guess, again, it's kind of just like a template that we use to kind of collect the key design drivers. So really the feedback from the LCA reports that we got from a lot of our consultants, it's pretty much like from our experience of saying, what areas of this report do we kind of skim over or ignore, and which are kind of like the main line items that we actually sort of look at, and actually kind of like taking those and then putting them into consolidated sheet to make sure that we're getting them on every project and that we're not getting too much extra fluff that we don't really look at sometimes.
You are also using the zero carbons, the zero, like the CAGBC zero carbon guidelines
sure.
as sort of the common ground denominator in terms of reporting the material, right?
Yeah, they have their own template. Ours is a little bit more detailed just because I think we can make it a little more specific to our project. Like we've got like, I think on our latest version, we've added like approximate volume of like transfer slabs, like things like that, where it's like a little bit more into detailed in terms of the actual design rather than just reporting the results.
Great. I hope that answers the question, Mohammed. And then Susan had a follow-up question, may not be a follow-up, maybe a separate question. Do you plan to eventually be performing blower door testing? If yes, would you have a desired air tightness limit? I guess is air tightness one of the things that you're prioritizing in your sort of schedule of values as you're, whether it's Teddy, it's air tightness, is it just emissions? So yeah, Susan's questions are whether air tightness is part of the sort of priorities.
I'd say like it's a little difficult because I find air tightness sort of bridges the gap between modeling and real world, which is super interesting. But I'd say again, it's kind of like a bit of a next step for us. A lot of our information and data to date has been just based on models. And so as we do get more of these buildings coming online, we can start doing more airtightness testing and actually saying, okay, is that assumption that's in our model accurate? Can we tighten that up? Should we give more leniency and actually give a little bit more feedback into our models from the real life? But we do kind of have to go through that development cycle a little bit more. I think we've got a few airtightness tests scheduled, but again, we don't have sort of like a huge repository of those results yet, but that is like on the agenda for sure.
Yeah, actually, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, I was just going to say, we're going to have to do it with our TGS version 4 projects as well as that passive house pilot I mentioned. So for sure, we're going to be building the data set. I think originally we thought that pilot project was going to be going into construction sooner than it's anticipated to now. And so we were kind of hoping that that was going to be kind of the vanguard and really allow us to cut our teeth. And now that it's just been pushed out with these economic things, I think we're starting to go back and see, what's the other project that's coming up quick that we can actually maybe bring some of this forward, because until we start getting real data, I think we're reticent to really project too far ahead in terms of where we need to go with this.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to build on that to say I think there's one of the things that it's going to be really fascinating to see in the next couple of years as some of these, especially those 5 projects you spoke to as part of your sort of benchmarking, if you will, is the sort of post occupancy or post construction data to compare back to that, right? To the sort of what was anticipated.
That
I think that's going to be really telling.
Yeah, and that's another interesting point. So what we've been doing concurrently with all of this is we've actually put together sort of a sub-metering and data collection standard. A big thing with being a condo builder, primarily condo builders, you build the building, you turn it over to the condo corp.
Right.
After the first year, you don't really know how this building you built's performing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a lost opportunity that there's really not a good feedback loop, at least within the condo side of the industry. So we've now gone to a consolidated metering procurement. We've got a single provider across our entire portfolio, and we're standardizing all our common area end use sub-metering design. And then we've actually gone to all of our condo docs and changed the language to basically say the default is that they're going to disclose it to us. And essentially they're going to disclose it to us until they tell us not to. So it's sort of like switched on when we turn over the condo. And we're setting it up with the metering provider so that we're hoping we can at least get sort of the first 3 to 5 years of data, have it kind of break through that break in and stabilization period, and at least get that so that we can go back and validate it. Because models are great, they're what we have and we're going to use them,
Exactly.
but
Yeah.
ultimately we got to move past that as soon as we can and get to real world data to just make sure that what we think we're doing is actually what we're achieving.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we can bring you guys back to present on what what your actuals were, what actual findings were at some point in the future. With that, I'm going to say we're at time. So thank you so much, both of you, for your time today, for an amazing presentation, for sharing all this material. I will also point out that people are welcome to contact you if they have questions or through us if you like. And thank you once again. Have a good afternoon and goodbye.
Thanks so much,
Thanks
everyone.
everyone. Thanks for having us. Take care.